There's a moment that quietly appears in many lives. At first, it feels small. You meet someone new, the story begins differently. A different personality, a different background, a different beginning. But after some time, something familiar begins to appear. The same emotional tension, the same misunderstandings, the same feelings of being too close or somehow still far away. And slowly, a question forms the background of the mind. Why does this keep happening? Not once, not twice, but again and again. In many lives, there comes a point where people begin to notice something unsettling. The faces change, but the experience feels strangely similar. When this realization appears, most explanations tend to move towards two directions. One direction says, I just keep meeting the wrong people. The other direction turns inward. There must be something wrong with me. But human patterns are really that simple. Relationships are not only encounters between two people, they are also encounters between two inner worlds. And sometimes what repeats is not the person, it is the pattern. If someone looks back across their relationship, a quiet detail often becomes visible. The people who enter their life are rarely random. Something about them feels familiar, even when they're completely new. A certain emotional tone, a particular intensity, a kind of distance or closeness. And the mind often calls this chemistry. But familiarity can easily disguise itself as chemistry. The nervous system recognizes something it has felt before. This familiarity carries a strange comfort, even when the experience later becomes difficult, because what is familiar is easier to interpret, predictable, understandable. It is like hearing a song whose rhythm is already known. Even if the song itself is sad, the structure feels recognizable. And for this very reason, many people unknowingly move toward what feels familiar, even when it does not lead to peace. Eventually, a deeper question begins to emerge. If certain relationship experiences repeat across different people, where does the repetition actually come from? Is it personality? Is it choice? Or is there something deeper shaping these encounters? Human life unfolds in phases, not always visibly, but very consistently. There are periods where independence becomes important, period where intimacy becomes central, periods where emotional intensity increases, and periods where life begins asking for stability and structure. Most people recognize these shifts only after some time has passed, but relationships often appear within these phases, not randomly, but in a response to what a particular chapter of life is activating. For example, in some phases of life, people are drawn towards excitement. Relationships begin quickly. They feel magnetic, powerful, consuming. In other phases, the same person may find themselves drawn towards calmness, towards reliability, towards something quieter. The external story may look different, but the internal chapter has changed. And when a chapter remains incomplete, similar relationships may appear again, not as punishment, simply as continuation. This repetition is often misunderstood as failure, but in many cases, it's simply unfinished learning, an emotional pattern that has not yet fully revealed itself. And life patiently continues presenting variations of the same theme until the structure becomes visible. Ancient traditions looked at life through a slightly different lens. In the system of Jyotish, often called Vedic astrology, life is understood less as personality and more as timing. The idea is simple. Life unfolds in chapters. Different periods activates different emotional themes, different desires, different kinds of relationships. These chapters are traditionally described through something known as dasha. Dasha simply refers to extended life periods where certain psychological dynamics become stronger. During some life periods, attraction becomes stronger, emotional connection form quickly. Relationships may feel intense, even transformative. In other periods, responsibility becomes more prominent. Relationships may slow down. Expectations change. Questions about commitment, patience, and long term structure begin to appear. These changes are not random, they're part of the architecture of life. Timing. Jyotish also describes certain psychological principles that shape how people experience relationships. The moon, for example, represents the emotional mind, the way safety, belonging, and emotional comfort are experienced. Depending on how the moon is structured in a person's life, a blueprint, certain relationship dynamics may feel natural, while others feel difficult to sustain. Another principle often discussed is Venus. Venus reflects the relating principle, how attraction forms, how harmony is experienced, how affection is expressed. Then there is Saturn. Saturn represents responsibilities, boundaries, reality. When Saturn becomes active in someone's life, relationships often become more serious, sometimes slower but deeper. There is also a planet or a principle known as Rahu. Rahu represents fascination, curiosity, sometimes obsession. When Rahu like energies become active in life, relationships can feel unusually magnetic. People may feel drawn toward experiences that are unfamiliar or intense. Again, these are not predictions. They are simply patterns that appear in the architecture of life timing. The exact way this plays out depends on your personal structure. When repeating relationship patterns appear, it can be useful to pause before assigning blame. Instead, a quieter reflection becomes possible. If certain emotional experiences keep appearing, what part of your own emotional structure is being activated? Perhaps you notice that you feel drawn towards people who are distant, or toward people who need reassurance. Perhaps intensity appear very quickly, or perhaps closeness feels difficult to sustain. You may begin to observe the rhythm rather than judge the experience. When attraction begins, what emotion appears first? Excitement, recognition, relief. Sometimes the strongest attractions are simply signals of familiarity. And familiarity can be powerful, but awareness gradually changes the rhythm. You may notice yourself slowing down slightly, observing more carefully, responding differently. And often, that small shift is where the pattern begins to change. In many lives, repeating relationship experiences are not mistakes, they are signals. Signals that a particular chapter of life is still unfolding. And once the pattern becomes visible, the next relationship often begins from a different place, a little slower, a little clearer, a little more conscious. Not because life forced a change, but because understanding quietly appeared.